Hi, welcome to Markc. This is a channel dedicated to Catholics, Protestants, and Orthodox alike. Today I'm joined once again by Dr. Michael Martin. We will look at a few more of his works today, just beginning with one, The Chemical Wedding of Christian Rosencrantz. So what is this chemical wedding, and why has it perplexed and amazed and even entertained generations of readers ever since its release in the 17th century?
Yeah, well, it's been called alchemical romance. So it's kind of 17th century science fiction in one way, or fantasy fiction, because it's a crazy book. And some people have tried, the reason it's amused and perplexed people because in the 17th century, when the Rosicrucian furor happened, that whole thing fascinated all of Europe, and nobody could see where it was going. So this Rosicrucian announcement comes out, and then nothing followed. It's kind of like QAnon. Nothing happens afterwards. But and then so there were first two documents, the Fama and the Confessio, the famous confession of the Rosicrucian order, and they're kind of fanciful works as well. They kind of invent a legend of Christian Rosenkreuz, the alleged founder of the group. But then after a few years after that, of 1617, when The Chemical Wedding came out, and it wasn't translated into English till about 1690. And again, and this one was even more. It's like an acid trip. It's that fascinating and cosmic. It'd make a great movie. I think, in fact, I think if they were to make a movie of it, they have nowadays. You could do it because we have, I think, with CGI and things, you could really do a good job of it. Yeah. But it's very funny, too. And what perplexed me about it, I first read it in my early 20s, and it's kind of an interesting thing, but you're not sure that you get it. And then I was in a group of people. We all did a study group of it. I was probably in my late 20s by that point, and still trying to puzzle it out. And it kind of hung around in my psyche for 20 or 30 years. And when I was in graduate school, I had a good friend. His name's Don, and he said, "You ever read that book?" Yeah, I read that a couple times. He said, "I'd love to see what you can do about that. Write an essay about it or something." And I think he put the bug in my ear. And then I think it was after I did the Submerged Reality and the Heavenly Country, I was thinking maybe I should put out an edition of The Chemical Wedding. So because it would be fun, I wanted a fun project. Yeah. And I had a couple things I wanted to write. I wrote 2 essays for it, one an introduction, and the second kind of a meditation on what the idea of a chemical wedding says about marriage, right? Mm-hmm. What's the metaphysic of marriage? So that was it was a fun project, but I think what it is ultimately, and this is why I put the book out, is because for so long, this book has been taken up by esotericists and occultists and historians trying to figure out what the secrets it's trying to tell are. And it took me a long time to figure this out, but there are no secrets. That's the secret. and what it is, I call it in the introduction, it's kind of a perspective box. You ever see those? Mm-hmm. In museums? They have one in the Detroit Historical Art Museum. They made these boxes that were painted according to perspective, and you look inside of them, and it looks like it's much different than it is. And it looks 3D, and it's really 2D. It looks like it's a tunnel or something, or they'll do different things to mess with your perception. And I think that's what the book does. It teases us with promises of secrets that it immediately divulges, and it makes fun of people who try to find secrets or think they have the secret information.
Yeah.
And they don't realize that they're being made fun of. Which was why I loved it. Yeah. And if you read the book Foucault's Pendulum by Umberto Eco, which is another book. It's very much like The Chemical Wedding in that it's a huge joke. It's a huge setup for a joke. And in that book, the main character, he and his friends invent this secret occult order just to sell books. And then all of a sudden, all the occult order people are like, "Oh yeah, I belong to that order," and they said, "But wait, you can't belong to it. We invented it." "No, you didn't. It doesn't matter. We belong to this order. It's important." And they eventually execute him. But right before he's executed, do you have anything left to say? And he gives them this Italian phrase. I can't remember what it is in Piedmontese, but it basically means "pull out the cork." Which is, you have a cork in your rectum and it's loading up with gas. So pull it out, And I think Eco was, I think when he wrote that book, he was ripping on the New Age movement and occult movements of the late 20th century. And I think that's exactly what Johann Valentin von André, who we think wrote The Chemical Wedding, that's what he was doing as well.
Marvelous. Yeah.
And the funny thing is the occult groups didn't get it, and they still don't get
it. Most interesting. I like the reference to QAnon too. And let's talk, if we might, about your related blog post then, and go into the metaphysics of marriage and some of those things that people also haven't seem to have got over the years. So you've written Eros, Talos, and The Chemical Wedding. And you describe this, pardon my Latin, but connectio oppositorum,
right.
that Charles Williams argues that sexual intercourse between a man and a woman is, or at least is capable of being in a remote but real sense, a symbol of the crucifixion.
Right.
And there's no human experience except death, which so enters into the life of the body. There's no other human experience which so binds the body to another human being. And then you talk about Pope Francis, as Pope Francis has instructed, the sacrament of marriage flows from the incarnation and the paschal mystery. Marriage, moreover, as the book of Revelation and even the Greek mysteries witness, is a telos, but without its elevation to mysticism, it inhabits a realm that is neither mysterious nor sacred and becomes a fraud, a sham, a carcass, something in need of regeneration. And then you take us to Berdyaev. Marriage is a sacrament, mystical marriage, he writes, is by its very meaning eternal and indissoluble. This is an absolute truth, but that most marriages have no mystical meaning and have nothing to do with eternity. Christian consciousness must recognize this. And then you say it's a hard saying, but very beautiful, though I find, and I think that's most important. So with that in mind then, and with other writings that you've written about marriage and human sexuality, what can you, is there anything you'd like to say about that now and how that is been a focus of some of your work and your journals, use the imagination?
Yeah, right. Well, yeah, marriage is one of my themes, I think, and I wouldn't have guessed that that's where I would end up. In fact, even for the book I'm writing now, Sophia in Exile, there's a chapter on sexuality and marriage. And why I think part of it, is because our understanding in Western culture of what the word marriage means has changed so drastically in the last 15 years. So that's probably certainly what got me thinking about it. Because it's my critique of nominalism. That's where it kind of centers on that. We can change what that term means. We can change what any term means. And so, that kind of compelled me to really think deeply about what marriage is. I mean, what is it? And I've never been satisfied with the kind of standard theological answer that that marriage doesn't count anymore once you die. Is that true? I don't know if it's true. I don't think not all the fathers were in agreement with that. And then I do think that our understanding of marriage has been compromised over the centuries by having people who were celibate monks in charge. I think that's seriously a big problem, because, definitely when I grew up in Catholic school in the 1970s, you definitely got the sense then that the priesthood was for those who could make it, but if you can't make it, you can get married. It's like it's the consolation prize.
Yeah.
But the church doesn't teach that. But that was the subtext. I mean, it's not sound Catholic teaching at all. But that's really how, in practice, that's what it's been. And I think it's been like that for a long time. And I actually think what we saw with the various sex scandals in the church is really intimately connected to that. I think you send a bunch of boys to a minor seminary, you're asking for trouble. You're asking for trouble. So I've been really thinking about what marriage is, and Carl Jung was actually who didn't come up with the term, but definitely talked about it quite a bit, was the conjunction of opposites, or the conjunctio oppositorum. What does that mean? I mean, can there be a marriage without opposites? If in my own life, my own wife, people meet us, and I'm more gregarious and outgoing, and she's very quiet, so opposites do tend to attract, because you need to balance yourself out, that's, and marriage is in some degree is a kind of training ground, because as Charles Williams said, when you point that out, and actually Vladimir Soloviev said the very similar thing, is that in a kind of erotic love relationship that is most fittingly represented in marriage, you sacrifice your ego for the other person. And that's how marriage works. And if a person doesn't do that, marriage doesn't work. It just can't. So you sacrifice your ego for that other person, which was like, especially in the early years of marriage, that's a hard lesson to learn. Or I shouldn't say lesson, it's a hard skill to develop. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So that's what, that's why, I think I talk about it a little bit in the Submerged Reality. I think I talk about marriage in every book I've put out. And really the question with, how do we come to a proper Christian understanding of marriage? Because I have not heard one really. I think Burjaya, what he's getting at is true. I mean, look, why aren't most marriages mystical marriages? And the book I've been writing, in that chapter, we talk about the troubadours, right? Where we're in the 12th century, where love started to be something asserted on its own terms and not as a political arrangement, right? Mm-hmm. Well, that's why, a lot of Protestants, most Protestants, I think all, don't consider marriage a sacrament, because there it is in some context a kind of business deal, right? But if you look in Genesis, right, let us make man in our image. It is not good that the man should be alone, right? So I think there's something, and plus, if we think of let us make man in our image, male and female, made he them. If you think of God as speaking to Sophia at that utterance, hey Sophia, let us make man in our image, then that gives it even more religious and metaphysical import. Mm-hmm. And I think that's the part that's been missing.
Yeah, and then I think Dr. Vegan-Gurian too looks at the Trinitarian implications of that the image of the Trinity is balancing otherness and oneness together, because obviously that's what the Trinity does too. Mm-hmm. So both of those insights I think are beautiful and important. Yeah. And I think as you allude to there, take us beyond the transactional approach, and Dr. Vegan-Gurian talks about the difference between how historically the idea of marriage is developed along contractual lines versus its proper or how it should be properly understood in terms of covenant and so on. And I
Mhm.
shared some really wonderful things about that. I just want to move on to your journal then, Jesus the Imagination, where you provide us with some further stirring words about this vocation and mysterion of marriage. So if I may quote a little bit more. So you say Eros imbues our relationship with nature, characterizes our experiences of marriage, and consummates our encounter with the God who informs all things. Married love indeed is the Lord's chosen metaphor for his union with the faithful, and not the other way around. So let us rejoice, therefore. This journal that you've produced includes some wonderful essays that people will not really find in many other places. So Father Jonathan Tobias's article on marriage, I thought was excellent, and its eschatological quality. And this is more well known probably in Orthodoxy. I think even amongst Eastern Christians, it's not really fleshed out enough. Plus, even if marriage per se is respected, we often see still an undervaluing of human sexuality and
Mhm.
its integral part of the sacrament. So, is
The
this,
sacrament of the sacrament, right?
yeah.
Yeah.
So, is this, I guess, a failure of incarnational nerve, if we might call it that, to give marriage and sexuality their proper eschatological character? And then part of why the secularist sexual revolution has been so successful, I wonder.
Yeah, I think it is. And I also, it's interesting. I read something recently that the religious group with the most satisfying sex life is the Amish. I have a lot of Amish friends. I haven't talked to them about that yet. I don't want to approach the topic, but yeah, I mean, I think to go to the problem, and you mentioned Father Tobias's article, and actually I talked to him about that recently, because when I was writing this chapter on marriage, I was trying to piece that out, and he was really good at thinking through it, and he's a he's a real sophiologist, Father Tobias, and in it's the weirdest thing in Orthodoxy and in Catholicism, uh, for the married priesthood. It's kind of one of the rules or recommendation. I think it's a rule, but I think it's been demoted to recommendation for deacons, is that the night before the Eucharist, married priests are told not to engage in sexual relations with their wives. Why? What's it going to do to the Eucharist? I thought that's what I thought. Doesn't it say be fruitful and multiply? Right? So, and that's the weirdest thing. Now, the thing is, though, in Hasidic Judaism, many, in the Kabbalah, they're just the opposite. And they on the evening of the Sabbath, they say if a man and his wife unite in intercourse in loving embrace, that it's kind of images the reunion of God and his Shekinah, which is what brings salvation to the world, right? And so, boy, we kind of missed the boat on that one, didn't we? So and I think that that's expressly a product of monasticism sneaking into married life, which it doesn't make any sense. And what happens if a priest offers the sacrifice of the mass or the liturgy every day of the week?
Yeah.
And
And
even you read some where they encourage men and women, men and their wives to live like brother and sister, to more fully devote themselves to God. That's insanity.
yeah.
It really is. It's pathological. And I
Yeah.
think that kind of pathological thinking actually has warped a lot of the theology of marriage. And until John Paul II he tried to rehabilitate that with the theology of the body, and God bless him for doing it, but it was like a day late and a dollar short, right? And he knew it was wrong, and which is what, and it's beautiful. I mean, think about this, in human sexuality, male female sexuality, where the male sexual organs are on the outside of the body, and the female sexual organs are on the inside of the body. I mean, is that not reciprocity, right? In fact, it reminds me, Joseph Campbell, I think we talked about him last time too.
Yeah.
He said one time, he was talking about male and female sexuality, and he said, well, let me just put it this way. In primitive cultures, women set the traps and men hunt. That's kind of all you need to know about the psychology of sexuality, or male and female sexual or psychology even, right? So I think, and that goes back to what I was talking about earlier with the conjunction of opposites. I mean, it's just beautiful, that image.
Yeah,
You can tell they were made to be together.
Yeah, wonderful. And it's something that comes across in your work too, is the fact that it's cosmic. And I think even Peter Kreeft has talked about this for the Humanum series that the church put out, about how modern people will assume we're just projecting masculine and feminine, these categories, onto the universe, whereas he says that makes us strangers to the universe, but it is actually something that's sort of built into creation, this yin and yang,
right?
balance, and that our language really reflects reality, if that's a fair way to put it. And
yeah, really, and our language reflects reality, and as we talked last time a little bit, and now it's against policy to mention fathers, mothers, brothers, sisters, uncles, daughter-in-laws in the United States Congress.
Yeah.
You couldn't make this. If you told me about this 10 years ago, 15 years ago, I would have said you are completely nuts.
Yeah. And then I guess, again, for me, it seems that if we don't understand these in the proper theological senses, then we don't have a capacity. We can't put trust against those challenges from the outside culture, because they're just merely social constructions, and the idea that gender is fluid and everything then becomes up for grabs, and the church is going to be very hard pushed to argue against it. That's one thing Goroyan said too. He said about even bringing the Eucharist back into the Mass, the ceremony in Orthodoxy, for example, so that it's central to our understanding of religious freedom and everything, and it shouldn't be something that the state can force us to celebrate same-sex so-called marriages and so on. Which is, I guess, a very important point. So I wanted to ask you something else, actually, about what you were saying before. There was, I guess, the Old Testament notion of you had to be ceremonially clean, and there couldn't be like sexual emission of sexual fluids. You had to separate different foods and everything then. So can you maybe help us understand why that was the case, and if these things are not ultimately unclean, or something that we need to be separating from the Eucharist and so on? Does that make sense?
Well, I don't know if I have an ultimate answer for that, but the answer I like is that the Israelites were a people of the desert, right? So so a big part of their religious or theological understanding had everything to do with fertility, right? Because you're living in the desert, you're much closer to death than even where I live, on a farm like this, because it's merciless. There's a great scene in the film, if you've seen it, The Last Temptation of Christ, where John the Baptist tells Jesus, you want to meet God? He's out in the desert. The God of Israel is the God of the desert, but he's not alone out there, right? For the temptation. And so I think part of that, with the prohibitions about menstrual fluid, other kinds of emissions from the body connected to sexuality. Those are the things that belong to God. They don't make you unclean, but they belong to God, which is why you're not worthy of that. So those kinds of things that contribute to creation of life, those are mysteries that you can't. And I think that's how the Israelites saw it, right?
Mm-hmm.
But that did not, at least for the Kabbalists and I don't know how it was actually in, say, First Temple Judaism or even the time of Christ, the understanding about relations between a man and his wife on the Sabbath. But you can see, though, that and you better believe that Hasidic Jews take the Torah literally, right? But it doesn't prohibit them from joining together on the Sabbath as a way to mirror the joining of God and the Shekinah, right? Which is to bring salvation to the world, right? And that's a beautiful. I mean, think about that. I mean, then it's no longer, when there's two kinds of, there's unclean and there's dirty, right? So maybe unclean, we got to find a better word for that, right? Maybe, having touched the mystery, you need to be purified. Kind of like re-entry when astronauts come back, they have to go through a decontamination process or something. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
They have to go in quarantine for a little bit just to make sure they're pure. They can enter back into the world.
Wonderful. And then aside from that, all of that as well, is there the idea too that Christ made all things new and has transfigured all these things. So even those Old Testament distinctions and everything take on a new character. And is it more just in line with what you're saying there, more about having things in the right order rather than perceiving it in a really negative way?
Well, that's, in fact, my wife was, this morning, she has a Torah study group. She's with us, some of her friends. And she said when she came back today that part of what they were reading Exodus, and there was something about circumcision in there, right? Which that meant something in the Old Testament times, but then you get to St. Paul and there is no circumcision, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so I think Christ does make all things new. But I also think, this is a very kind of esoteric way to think about this, is that the purpose of the Hebrew people, coming from a Christian standpoint, was to create the body for Christ to take, right? So in Genesis, the story of Jacob with Laban's sheep and all his livestock, where he's breeding them, right? And so there's all kind, and even with the genealogies, the two genealogies in Matthew and Luke, they're two different genealogies for one thing, but they're images of creating the right body. And now it's interesting, in Matthew, the body comes through the line of the kings, whereas the body in Luke comes through the line of the shepherds or the prophets, right? Kind of interesting. Now, and I think it all, and then Christ appears. The kingdom of heaven is at hand, right?
Yeah,
and then he kind of, in his big conflict is not, the people he condemns are the leaders of the synagogue. Doesn't even criticize Rome. Criticizes the leaders of the synagogue, not the people.
Most interesting. Just next then, if we may, can we go on to the submerged reality and take a quote from that, especially as this relates to our modern dominant secularist culture then? So you say in that wonderful book, Contra Gauche, secularization, the disenchantment of the world, is not built into the structure of religion as its teleological inevitability. Rather, your claim is that the secularization is a pathology, a kind of cancer that is metastasized on the body of the church militant. This pathology, however, generated and continues to generate other pathologies. And you say that our current postmodern moment, materialistic, technological, technocratic, atheistic, it exemplifies nominalism writ large. Here, there are no universals, there are no ideas, no archetypes, only names. You say marriage, for instance, no longer embeds universal cultural archetypes of husband and wife, and indeed, postmodern cultural norms have become increasingly and militantly hostile to the essential significance of biblical and gender typology and the biblical and theological significance of sexual difference. So marriage, previously assumed as the union of one man and woman into an organic whole, has been relativized beyond the point of recognition. A collateral ontological shift has also occurred in the postmodern understanding of the word family. Perhaps most emblematic of this shift is the new concept of the term gender, which tellingly has proved the most plastic of all. Does this notion of elective gender reassignment surgery, like nominalism, assert in the clearest terms that universals do not exist? So would you like to go into that a little bit? And
Should I get my lawyer with me? I'll get my lawyer. I think Mr. Cohen. Well, I mean, that's what was I wrote that in 2014, probably 2015. That's when the real big debate in this country was going on about gay marriage, right? And that's when I started seriously thinking about it. At least somebody had to seriously think about it, because it's so easily we're so easily manipulated or by the news media and social media. But I think when I talk about secularization, and my tiff with Gaucher is because he looks at religion as Christianity as the religion for leaving religion, and he's got a point. But he's got a point because the way he reads it, that when Catholicism broke at the Reformation, and then Protestantism is really, in my opinion, they're the ones who are most responsible for secularization, because that was the beginning of the disenchantment and the desacralization of the world. Even though that had happened, as I mentioned, with nominalism, that was the seed, but the real break was at the Reformation, which didn't take very long for the Reformation to lead to the Enlightenment. It's a natural outgrowth of it, and secularization is a total outgrowth of that development, because God was more and more exiled from the world. But then you'd see in the West, in Catholic countries, especially among the peasantry, right? There, not only was God more present in the world, but so were angels and demons and fairies, and it was more of a sacramental world still that was kind of living, existing alongside the increasingly secularized world that was produced, or at least kicked off by the Reformation, and so, but it doesn't need to be that way, and that's why I wrote the Submerged reality. In fact, I was talking to my good friend Therese Schroeder-Schieker yesterday about precisely this. That's why I wrote the book, is because like right now we're looking at secularization on ludicrous speed right now with the coming of the fourth industrial revolution, right? That's the apotheosis of it now. But I wrote the Submerged reality trying to I don't know, avert that, but trying to offer another way to think about it. And this is why Adrian Pabst, in his introduction, calls what I'm doing an alternative modernity, right? Mm-hmm. Because there is this alternative modernity, and you see, and all the figures I read about in the book, from the Hermeticists and Burma, Flood, the Vaughns, and then later with the Romantics, Rudolf Steiner, the Russian Sophiologists, and so on. that is like, to me, this alternative stream, right? It's the pushback, but it's a maintaining a more integral vision of the human person and of creation, right? And that's and that's what I, what I hope for is that we can get people, by getting people aware of sophiology, and it's not really as esoteric as it might sound, right? It's very practical. It's very practical spirituality, a very practical Christianity, you know. So and I think it's also healing to a world and a society and societies that are really, really broken in their relationship to the world. I mean, before, you can say the first break was our the exile of God, or us from God, but now we're exiled from nature as well. So I mean, that's kind of a attempt to go back.
Yeah,
Or
excellent.
go forward. You go forward to go back.
And I've been reading a lot of G.K. Chesterton recently, actually, in the hope of creating some courses for online to teach him. And I think there's a lot in his work too that complements your own, at least as far as I'm concerned, and offers an alternative modernity too. And he seems to have seen through all of these things and maintain the continuity with the older romantics and everything, but in a very distinctly kind of orthodox way. And I wanted to ask you also about something in case there's any misconceptions. I was thinking about this over the last few days. What, well, I think it's obvious to me anyway, but how does your work differ from, say, Jung and Sophia versus how he understands the Virgin Mother, for example, and he kind of makes that, what is it, quadernity thing, if that's the right word. And would you like to speak to that a little bit? Or?
Well, I mean, I have a lot of affection for Jung, but what I'm doing is not psychology or archetypes. He's really, and I love that, he really, in a way, gave Christianity a new way to think about Christianity, right? Kind of reinvented the vocabulary in a kind of modern sense, but he was not doing theology. He was not even doing philosophy. He was doing psychology, and he's trying to see how and I think what's important is when he talks about the conjunction, how healthy that is to integrate your opposite, right? And so for instance, some people have said to me, like Milbank, right, calls me a feminist theologian, and I've had people tell me, "Why, you have a really developed feminine side." I'm like, really? Okay. Does that mean I'm still butch though, right? So but I think what happened, you can, and they taught you, right, you hear this talk about toxic masculinity. Have you heard this?
Yeah.
Which I don't get what they're talking about, but there's a toxic femininity too. These are unintegrated human beings. They're not fully fledged human beings yet. They're acting, and this is what Jung talks about. They're acting out of a kind of neurosis, right? So, how do you integrate that? And I that's what I appreciate in Jung. But he's not doing theology, and I'm not doing psychology, right? What I'm doing, if anything, it's a kind of a phenomenological, kind of very straightforward examination of things in this world. I don't know if my work is difficult for people to understand, even though my wife says it is. But I think what I'm doing is very simple and very commonsensical, and very almost looking at things. And I've noticed the theme in this new book I'm writing is very Thomas Trahernian, where you need to learn how to see like a child again, right? It's a very simple approach. So it's interesting, right?
And you are obviously also not saying, in case there's any misconception, as if the Trinity isn't enough or that you need something else, but you're talking about the character of how God creates and communicates to the world and so on. Is that a better way to phrase it or understand it?
That Sophia is the way God
Yeah.
communicates with the world.
Is
Is that
that
what you're saying?
is that enough, or is that a fair way to phrase it?
It's a challenging thing to piece out. What I would say when I think of Sophia, I told you before with like with the Virgin Mary, is that she's a kind of catalyst that makes grace perceptible, right? Um, that interestingly enough, as I think I also mentioned, is that it only responds to our attention. When people say, "Well, I didn't see it," right? And this is like we talked before, you might see a sunset, but you're in a lousy mood, right? So you don't see the sunset. You see your feelings. But somehow when you get to this disposition where you can accept what is there. There's an interview with Jacques Derrida one time, who I have a lot of respect for. And they're talking about images of himself. He said, I can't even judge it. I accept it. Right. So if you get to a point where, and accept doesn't mean approve necessarily. In this, we talked about agapeic criticism. This is kind of an agapeic disposition where you accept what's there and you're able to see it then. And that, I think, is what awakens the Sophianic in the world. In like the Gnostic myth where Sophia is in captivity, that I think those are those moments where Sophia gets, and it's not just Sophia in the world, it's like, it kind of corresponds to this Sophia in you, in the human person. There's a wisdom incarnate there too, which is in captivity until we perceive it on the outside, and it's I don't know if I mentioned this before, but David Bohm, the quantum physicist and philosopher, he has this idea called implicate order, where the universe is implicit in us and we are implicit in the universe. So we're both part of a system. We can't be a disinterested observer outside of nature. It's ridiculous, right? So, but he talks about this implicate order where the whole is implied in the part, and the part is implied in the whole. And I think that's exactly what I'm talking about. And in Bohm, believe that if we could get enough people to do that, that would be the healing of the world, right? Because our scientists don't have that understanding. At least most of them don't, For example, if, so say they come up with some new engineering or scientific marvel, like say nuclear power. It's gonna save money. It's gonna be a great source of power. Then you have Fukushima. So then you have your one scientific marvel, but now you have to think of another scientific marvel to clean up the problems from the last scientific marvel. And why does this happen? Because you're not thinking of yourself as part of nature. You're thinking of nature as this thing out there.
Yeah, that's
disordered
right.
thinking.
There's no wisdom, obviously, and it I don't know if is this a fair way to also maybe get at it too, that it's similar to the way Saint Maximus the Confessor talks about the logi. You're seeing this Sophianic quality, like the logi,
Right.
the microcosm and the
Right.
macrocosm together.
That's what he's talking about. That was his word for it, but I think it's the Sophianic what it is.
Yeah, wonderful.
Yeah.
Okay, doke. So back to marriage then, if we may. So I think your work shows also that the idea that marriage isn't sacred or only for this life is not biblical. As you say, it's not in all the fathers either. St. John Chrysostom and different ones argue otherwise. And it seems to involve a few misreadings of different key texts from Genesis, the Song of Songs, the New Testament.
Mm-hmm.
So what then, we've already spoke about this a bit, but what is the actual good news for marriage and sexuality, and how does this contrast with the secularist notions and also the more conservative but less biblical line? For example, it seems to be that like St. Paul, for example, whenever he was talking about celibacy, he was speaking at a more pragmatic level.
Right.
And we take this to be something that's true more broadly, and then theologize it and everything.
Right.
Said that there's no need to Platonize this, if I'm right. And Father Raymond Collins suggests also that the apostles were not to leave their wives indefinitely. It was only for a time, and it was for
Right.
missionary purposes and so on. And that's something that's been theologized, even the way we perceive bishops and everything. So are there any examples like that that you'd like to correct or maybe help us to get around?
Let's see. I think I guess the way to think about it, let me think here, is that, well, I think the problem text is in Corinthians, where Paul says, he tells it's better to marry than to burn, right?
Mhm.
But he doesn't. The thing is, the reason he said that is because he thought the second coming was really soon at that time, And then you can see if you read, I think Second Thessalonians was written first, and First Thessalonians was written second. Because in Second Thessalonians, he's more anxious about the second coming. In First Thessalonians, he's more relaxed about it, because maybe it's not coming yet. But I think in Corinthians, he was still anxious about it. That's why he said it's better to marry than to burn, because there's really no point in marrying if the second coming's next week. But it wasn't next week, right? And still, it still hasn't arrived. In fact, speaking of Derrida calls it the non-arrival of the Messiah. Because you think about it, right? And he says it, he goes, and he's a Jew. He says, I really want the Messiah to come, right? But on the other hand, I got stuff planned. I really don't want the Messiah to come. You know what I mean? And I think that's something we don't admit to ourselves sometimes.
Yeah.
When I was a little kid, boy, I was terrified of the eschaton, right?
Yeah.
I don't know if it was the way it was presented to me in Catholic school or what it was, but I was terrified. But I think, look, the first miracle Jesus performs is at a wedding. Does that tell you anything, right? And it's not just that, like I say, and look at the Song of Songs. This erotic poem in the middle of the Old Testament that never mentions God and never mentions the law. And that was, in fact, that's actually in the book I'm writing. And I think that was hijacked by the monastic orders or by the priests, even by the Jewish priests. It was hijacked because they wouldn't even let the laity read that. Yet, it's funny. It's the most commented book in the Old Testament or in the Bible through all of the medieval period. And when the printing press was first invented, at least in England, it was, I think it's like, I can't remember, 75 or even 120, something like that. A ridiculous amount of editions of the Song of Songs and paraphrase and other forms came out from the early 1500s to 1680. So every couple of years, another edition was coming out, and people weren't just reading that to be told it doesn't really mean anything about marriage, even though they would get that was not all there was to it. And I think, like you said, that there's this sacramental dimension of the marriage and the sacrament of the marriage bed has been overlooked or denigrated even through much of history, with a few exceptions. And I think one of the few and one of the more beautiful ones is the one Vladimir Soloviev presents in his book, The Meaning of Love, right? Because people have been afraid to touch it. And I think they've been afraid to touch it, we could say, because it does intrude upon the creative powers of God. But what a tragedy that, and I think that this is what happened. And in a way, the Catholic Church invented Sigmund Freud by taking the Song of Songs away from the laity. right? By not sacralizing that at the time. And I think you see this. I mean, you see people now, I don't know, neo-pagans and things that are really, they do have a fascination or attraction to the church, but they can't quite get the relationship to the body or the non-relationship to the body that superficially they might perceive, you know. So I think that's why they're attracted. In fact, that's why they're attracted to paganism, with the festivals of paganism, which are essentially Catholic festivals taken out of context. You know, if they're celebrating Beltane or Lammas, and those are Catholic festivals that have been reappropriated. Well, let's put it this way: the Catholics weren't using them, so we're going to take them out of mothballs and we use them ourselves. And, and I think it's what happened. So and that healthy eros, in the purest sense, relationship with creation and the cosmos and with God, I mean, to me, that's tremendously healing. And I think that's what people, especially in this age of the internet, you know, and the fourth industrial revolution, are hungering for an experience of something that's real, but that's both spiritually and materially nourishing.
Yeah, marvelous. I think there are other problem texts, unfortunately, that people kind of take and run with. So a lot of people, I think, make the mistake of misreading Christ's response to the Sadducees about marriage and the resurrection. So Father John Mendorf and David Ford, a few Orthodox people, show in their books on marriage that this is a misreading, and Christ was really addressing the levirate practice of marriage and not the sacraments nor the world to come ultimately.
Right.
And even Orthodox then refer to the second part of that response about people being like the angels, as if that means there's no sex in the kingdom, whether in terms of sexual activity or in terms of sexual differences. But I don't see that necessarily following at all, and find that your work and people like Fabrice Jazz that I've mentioned to you before, that I think some of your work is important in addressing those things. Do you have any thoughts that you'd like to add about that element of it, and that idea that we're like the angels, or that?
Yeah, I haven't read those interpretations, though I do like Meyendorf, but it says that, but it says like the angels. It says not angel, right? So how do you explain this eros that we have, that Plato talks about in the Symposium, right? This eros that draws us toward God and toward each other, right? You know, that's what you love, right? You love, you love this individual person, for instance, but it's really, this is what Plato argues, right? It's really the love for that individual person is the love that is in the universe, or the eros, the beauty that is in the universe. So it's God's beauty you're attracted to ultimately. But I think to make those things asexual, I think it's enormously dangerous. You know, they're sexless in heaven. Boy, well then I guess Nancy Pelosi's right. You know, she's just a little ahead of the curve.
Yeah.
But I think I think it's tremendously wrong. And I think that kind of thinking in our cultures is destroying not only, I mean, a relationship with nature, a relationship with each other. You know, it's you know, in fact, just reading, you know, there was some President Biden just canceled some law or that Trump had written or invoked that kept trans athletes from competing. So say a young man decides he's a girl and he competes in sports against other girls. Well, they keep killing them, right? Because they might identify as female, but they're physically male, and so so many girls in those sporting events are getting destroyed by this boy essentially.
Mhm.
But I think that kind of there's no gender that is implied in some of those theological interpretations of scripture are really coming home to roost now.
Yeah.
You know, so I think you have to. That's why I think it's important to reassert the gender typological or biblical difference that Milbank talks about and that we see in Genesis. You know, and I think if you emphasize that when God is speaking to Sophia, you 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 emphasize how important that is. Because if the divine order is, even though they tell you it's not, they say it, they get mad when you say God's not a he. You're right. So if you insist that the divine order is masculine, like the priesthood, right? You're asking for pathology. So you need to, and this is what you're talking about Young. This is what Young was so excited about with the promulgation of the dogma of the Assumption, or the Immaculate Conception, is that he thought, wow, now this is good. This is actually healthy for the world, because it's the Catholic Church is integrating its feminine side. And I think it's always been there, right? It's always been there, but it's the submerged reality. It has to be brought more out into the open or something, right? And I think we need to emphasize because think about this: if God says, "Let us make man in our image, male and female," if it's God talking to Sophia, it means a lot different than God speaking to the Holy Spirit and Jesus, Christ the Son, right? You know, because otherwise, because the one sounds like a beautiful image of human creation. The other one sounds like guys at a workshop, right? Sounds like a fabric. You know, like, what are we making today?
Yeah, that's most interesting. I think too, regarding that actual quote about being like the angels, I would read that more even at a simple level as you're going to be ordered towards God, rather than thinking about, say, worldly concerns. About the Levirate marriage itself was a utilitarian arrangement, so that you'd have enough progeny for the future and everything, wasn't it? So that they had to go according to those worldly standards, whereas Christ, it seems to me, was shifting the emphasis to God and playfulness and things like that that aren't necessarily useful by the metric of the world or
Yeah.
something.
I like that.
There seems to be also in St. Gregory of Nyssa and St. Maximus, for example, this, I think it's an exegetical notion about God preordaining marriage and sexuality is, again, this kind of mere utilitarian response to the fall, as if it's just for the purpose of building up the church to a certain number through procreation and so on.
Let's fill those pews, people.
And then they take that and read that as if there's no sexuality or marriage again in the resurrection. But I don't think, from reading the scriptures in their context, that makes sense at all either. I've seen some really good critiques of that. And you, Father Tobias, Father Meyendorff, Dr. Groyan, I mentioned, Frederica Matthews Green, David Ford, many others. Even going back to, as I mentioned before, St. John Chrysostom and the scripture itself, I think, show that marriage and human sexuality, this mysterion, is not just for this world, has that metaphysical quality, theological quality, and must be understood in all those terms. Again, as with food that we mentioned before and the renewal of the natural world, is it a case then that we die in a kind of self-given agape to our beloved, but become more human precisely for that reason, and because we become more like Christ? And whenever I was reading The Psychologist, Rollo May, actually, it came across that we think of, say, the sexual act is only erotic, but he describes it in a way that it sounds agapic, that you're giving yourself entirely to that other person. So that's just one part of this life of Christ. And would you like to speak to that?
Yeah. Well, they're the 4 Greek words for love, right? So, and I think marriage has them all. hence eros, obviously. I mean, it's falling in love. I mean, who doesn't love that feeling, falling in love, right? But there's also philia. I mean, friendship. There has to be friendship in a marriage. There's also the agapeic element to marriage, right? Where sometimes you don't get anything out of it. You just, you know what I mean? That's like, you most figure Christ, I think, in those moments. But there's also the storge element, which is a Greek word which means the kind of love you feel in responsibility, like for your children or for your spouse. So all those coalesce in marriage, at least in the marriages that work, you know, because you can't be married. I mean, I hate the phrase, my wife is my best friend, but I spend, because we work together on the farm, and we have a pretty good working relationship, we don't argue too much, uh, except for when I tease her and it gets on her nerves, but because we have all those elements there, but it has to be cultivated. You have to learn how to be married. You have to cultivate those capacities, I think, because they don't come naturally. They certainly don't come naturally. I mean, they're organically there, but they have to be disciplined and cultivated for sure. Yeah.
Yeah,
And I think, but that's also our relationship with God. All those elements need to be with God, right? I have a friend in Jesus, right? Plato, the erotic pull toward God, toward nature. Everything is what's Saint Augustine, right? Love calls us to the things of this world, right? That's beautiful. I mean, that's a beautiful phrase to live by.
Marvelous. I think too that speaks to another concern I had. So in a lot of the Orthodox readings that I think are mistaken, you have this idea that I mentioned before about the utilitarian thing, and then you get the idea that there was no sexuality in the Garden of Eden, which I don't even think is clear from the text anyway. But
Nope,
regardless,
it's not.
that doesn't mean that the kingdom will be the same, does it? Considering that Christ makes all things new, that the sacraments, matrimony, and the fact that we're not meant to stay spiritual
Right.
children like Adam and Eve in the garden, but to become mature adults in Christ and develop that storge those qualities that you're talking about. Is that fair?
Yeah, John Milton, not my favorite poet. I don't like the poets who called for Catholic genocide were not my favorites. But one thing he does make a point in Paradise Lost is before the fall, Adam and Eve were intimate, but after the fall, they treated each other like pieces of meat. Right?
Yeah.
It's a difference of disposition, right?
Mhm.
So who knows? I mean, who knows what erotic intimacy will feel like after the parousia, But I think that's, I mean, I think that eros, and this is Marsilio Ficino writes about this as well. That eros that attracts us to is not going to go away. It'll be purified, and I think that'll characterize our relationship with the beloved, and also with God in the afterworld. I don't see how it couldn't, because it's intimacy. What's the point? what's the point of the universe otherwise? Just is to live in a, I mean, I don't tend to think what heaven must be like, but I hope it's not this sterile environment like like a church social or something. That's my idea of hell, actually.
Yeah, I think it takes us back to that agapic and cruciform quality of sexuality that you point out in people like Williams and so on. And I also think I was thinking about this during the week. I wonder what you would say about this. That would it be fair to maybe understand it in a way of the way we have cataphatic and apophatic, so the people that are called to the celibate vocation experience God in that more apophatic way, but people who are married experience God in maybe a more cataphatic way, although obviously it can be a bit of both. And that it's the two the different emphasis regarding the great commandment to love God and one another. It's just about where you're putting the emphasis. Is that a fair way to phrase it? Does that make sense?
It makes sense.
That you're loving the other, you're loving God through the other, and
But even, well, depending, I don't know what I think about uh, the Aromatic path, but a lot of monasticism, the beautiful parts about monasticism is when they're embedded in the community, right? They're part of a community,
yeah,
right? Or a parish. I mean, I think that the parish, the way a parish should be, which is long and since broken, I think, but maybe it's more like that in parts of Ireland. That kind of small is beautiful approach relationship. And I think with between we could say the married orders and the monastic orders, the lay orders and the monastic orders. Whereas now those who are being monastic are kind of removed from the greater community. I mean, they can get involved, I think. So that would be, and this we were talking about Chesterton earlier. His distributism is a pretty much enterprise. And people know the farmer, us, we know them, we grow their food, right? And he builds relationships in this little network, which is as close to village life as I've been able to get it. Be even nicer or closer. And then that, I think from that kind of more intimate setting, you can develop a sense of community, which actually is a community. Unlike, when we use the word community now, it's so bent out of proportion, like the cigar smoking community, I've heard.
I want to ask you about actually Roger Scruton, the philosopher, and his work. I think it touches upon a lot of the things we're talking about too. So it's Scruton, I think, like Chesterton, he speaks to many of these points, and the way he describes sexuality in his work, I think, is most interesting, because Father John Burr and people like that have talked about marriage as martyrdom, which I think speaks to a lot of our points, but doesn't maybe go far enough, because there is this element in its fallen nature that we can objectify people. And there was another article by Aristotle Papanicolaou, I can't pronounce his name, sorry, the guy from Fordham, and he wrote
that guy.
how we can objectify the other and so on. But Scruton has a more interesting understanding, I think. He looks at the persons as subjects, and it's more like the personalism of John Paul II and so forth. And that just like in the life of the Trinity, you have the different persons,
Right.
we have different subjects that we love in our relationships. I think there's a theological import actually to his work, even as well as the philosophical. And as I was saying about Dr. Vegan Groyan, he talks about the Trinitarian nature of marriage, sexuality, and our life co-creating with God, in the sense that we have children and everything, which is beautiful, which unfortunately isn't the way most people within the church obviously understand it. Yeah, just one.
No, I like Scruton. I was just, what did I just read by him? I think it's called The Soul of the World. Yes.
Oh, wonderful.
That's when I was just reading. Yeah, I like Scruton. It's unfortunate that he died. A year ago now?
Yeah.
He died. And it's interesting. I don't know why he's such a polarizing figure. I don't know if you've noticed this.
Yeah.
A lot of Catholic philosophers want to hate him for some reason. In fact, I used to use a film clip of his in a philosophy class. I would talk because he's kind of that, in a way, a practical philosopher. You know what I mean? Looking at the things that we do and seeing where's the value in this. And in fact, in the video I used to show my students, part of it was him going on a fox hunt, which I'm showing that to students in Detroit, right? That's about the farthest thing from their experience. But he's talking about why this is important, because you have the relationship with the animals, you have the relationship with the community. It's really a community activity, right?
Yeah.
For him. And that's my own experience, which doesn't happen as often as I'd like, but in hunting, for instance. Hunting, because in where I live, we can go hunting. And for me, I don't know, it's not like this for everybody, I'm sure, but what I love about it is being with other people in the wild. In fact, Jose Ortega y Gasset calls it a vacation from civilization. And I'll never forget, a few years ago, when it was maybe 10 or 12 years ago, when I was a school teacher, I didn't have to work on Martin Luther King Day, which is the second Monday in January, or third Monday. And so I used to go hunting on Martin Luther King Day, and I was out rabbit hunting with my friend who happened to be black. And we're out there in the woods, we're looking around, and we bump into these other two guys who had hunting beagles with them, and they were also black. And we're all standing there talking about dogs and rabbits and stuff. And then we all kind of stopped and looked at each other and started laughing, because we realized it was Martin Luther King Day. And here was one white guy and three black guys in the middle of the woods with guns sharing jokes. So it's kind of a beautiful thing. And Scruton does that, he appreciates those little things that actually modernity rejects or tries to pretend we're outgrowing, but I don't think that's we should outgrow some things.
Mm-hmm.
There is this beautiful connection to creation that happens in those, and it's, I don't think we got anything that day. What was beautiful though is that there were bonds of kinship formed between the four of us. Even if it's just briefly, because I never saw those other guys again, and we only saw them one day. But it was beautiful, absolutely beautiful.
Yeah, wonderful. I think it speaks to a number of the points that we've been discussing, maybe, that a lot of modern people don't want to admit that they're part of this integrated order, and that this is an order that includes death, including death of animals and everything, and you have this weird relationship to the creation and to animals as if they never die or should never die, and we certainly shouldn't kill them.
Well, I think people do is they outsource their killing.
Yeah.
I mean, people who are vegans, people can do what they want to do with their lives, but it's actually a vegan diet is actually worse for the environment than a meat diet, because what it takes from the soil. And an integrated farm would have animals and plants and woods and water, because in that way you create a healthy environment, a healthy ecosystem. But yeah, people, even if you're eating plants and you're outsourcing death, you're having somebody else do the killing for you. And one of the things that, in fact, I was a vegetarian for 12 years, from the time I was about 18 or so, maybe 20, until I was 30. And I decided, what was funny, my wife was pregnant with our first child, and her midwife said, "So are you craving anything?" And my wife said, "Yeah, liverwurst." And the midwife said, "Well, you better eat some, because you're healthy, and if you have healthy people don't have bad cravings." And around the same time, I was dreaming about hunting. I said, maybe we need protein. So that led us into more seriously farming, because I figured if I'm going to be involved with this project of eating meat and even eating, vegetables, I should be involved in the killing, because you should take responsibility, And it's an interesting change in psychology from me being a kid who grew up in the city with packaged food to being someone who raises animals for food. But they say in the organic farming business that the animals have a great life and one bad day, right? So, you really form a bond with those animals, but it's not like you form with people, because, I have these hogs, for instance, and they love to see me in the morning when I go out to feed them. But I know if I had a heart attack and dropped dead there, they would eat me, you know? So there's a bond there, but it's still, we're a part of nature with them, and I feel, in fact, my pigs, the two of them, were not doing well for a couple of days. I think they got some cake or something around Christmas, because right after Christmas they were not getting up. So I had to take care of them. I brought them back to life using vitamin C and garlic. And yeah, I mean, but I think people just don't want to be involved with that, so they outsource it. And that's okay. It's probably not for everybody to do it, right? But I think you should, if you're going to engage in the eating of meat, for instance, that you should be concerned with an ethical relationship with the farmer, right? I'd say should, but that's the best possible way to do it.
Mm-hmm.
It's not possible for everybody, probably. But I think if people could do that, they would feel a more intimate relationship to nature, and they would feel more responsibility for what they take from nature. Because I think if you get things for, not for free, but for cheap and prepackaged, you don't value them in the same way that if you had to raise the animal, or even if you knew someone who raised the animal.
Most interesting. Yeah, I think that also is like Chesterton again, and the emphasis on the local and
yeah, absolutely,
private property. Which he understands in a very integral way, related to families and everything, not like
right.
our crude materialist understanding of having property and just gathering everything up.
Right, and that's that was a big influence, not just Chesterton, but that kind of distributed this idea when I wrote Transfiguration. And I was actually anticipating what I mean. We should start preparing for when things all fall apart, but I didn't realize it was going to happen in 2 years.
Yeah, it's amazing actually how prophetic your works are turning out already after 2 years, differently, like within 10
I
years.
really didn't realize. I knew it was coming, but I didn't realize it was coming. 2 years.
Gosh. Yeah, there's that double quality. It's the same with Chesterton. It's kind of beautiful that he's still so relevant, but it's kind of depressing that he's still so relevant. Back to another relatively unknown figure from the tradition. So there's an Orthodox historian and theologian, Dr. Eugenie Lampert. I'd love to quote a bit about from his work and see if there's anything you'd like to say about that. So it's a long one, but I'll share it here. So this, he talks about marriage and sexuality and how, like you say, we haven't integrated these things properly. He says this Platonist and Gnostic view, it infiltrated the thought of some of the greatest church fathers and colluded with hatred of sex and of women to cast out love from the world, portraying it as enticing lust, alluring falsehood, sweet poison, or simply as paganism. This infiltration has had disastrous consequences because it has killed the great religious dream of the holiness of sex and of love and of life as the feast of love. Sex was driven out into the prison of bourgeois family existence and domesticity, where it was tolerated, or else it was or is dragging on in an irreligious life in nightclubs and similar institutions. A fatal counterpose of marriage and the family conceived as mere matrimonial transactions. Sexual love found itself outside religion, unsanctified, abandoned to the whims of fate or of the devil. So in the face of this, Lampert claims that the creation of woman is the very acknowledgement of the reality of sex as the fulfillment of creation. Sex is a transcendent reality, then sexual life has a transcendent significance, while the notion or the union of the sexes is in love as a witness to the fullness of being and life eternal. So it's a true tragedy that the holiness of sexual love has been so blasphemed, on the one hand by cold dualism, detesting the flesh as a source of defilement, and on the other by an amoral monism which sees the flesh as the theatre of mere animal activity, Both are blind to the mystery and sacrament of holy flesh as the way of ascent into the heavens and the grace of the Holy Spirit descending on it. This sounds very much a Sophionic to me.
Absolutely.
Would you agree?
Absolutely. Yeah. And that's, I've talked about that before, especially with it's a Gnostic view, right? The flesh is evil. That's straight up Gnosticism, and it's foreign to the mission of Christ, right? Um, yeah, and like he said, it's, and look what it's done to women. Tertullian. You ever read Tertullian's book on on the dress of women? He doesn't even he he accuses them of the crucifixion of Christ because they're pretty. Oh my gosh. So yeah, there was some pathological stuff going on with some of the fathers, and like I said, they inhaled too much Neoplatonism, right? And they absorbed the I mean, it was like right now, right? You can't help but absorb postmodern theory because it's all over the place, right? So for those guys who were educated, they absorbed all the intellectual streams of their time, even though they thought they were rejecting them. They weren't. I mean, Augustine's a perfect example. I named one of my kids after Augustine, but come on, you kicked your common law wife to the curb so you could go get holy, right? Which is, I have a problem with that. I have a serious problem with it. Now I can be holy. I'll be a bishop now that I get rid of my wife. No, I can't countenance that. And yeah, I mean, it was a beautiful quote you offered there, because like I said, I think most of the pathologies the church is dealing with arise from that.
Yeah. And I want to ask you actually how this is played out in art, for example. So in a recent discussion with Pajot, who we mentioned before, and the Byzantine Catholic Matt Fradd, they spoke about nude statues and sensuality and so on. Did we speak about this already?
We did a little bit, yeah.
Oh, if there's anything you'd like to add, but so Jonathan took the
Well, you
view.
made me think about it, because the day after I was writing a book, I was writing the chapter in the book on that. I had to put that in there. Think about Michelangelo, right? Because he's talking about the Michelangelo's nudes, right?
Yeah, so Jonathan took the view that we can't really portray nudity in this life without shame, and Matt took an opposing view, but I thought it was still a bit too glib. That Jonathan seemed to have this idea that from Nyssa and Maximus and people like that about the garments of death and sexuality, and linking those two together against what we've been saying in this discussion, again, as if it's just a layer against death preordained in a kind of utilitarian sense. And they had this idea as if sensuality should primarily be understood in its, or at least in practice, in its power to deceive in its sinful form, as if this is not one of the things made new in Christ, or like you said, even in Milton, how it could be properly understood, but he perceived it in this life you couldn't even show in nudes and art and so on, that this was a pagan influence coming from outside the church. But the sense that I get from the scriptures and from your work, for example, and some of those people we mentioned, is that this is actually a biblical impulse itself coming out and not paganism. So as you said about the milieu of the early fathers was still in a fallen world, and they made mistakes, and they aren't the whole of the body of Christ. They haven't fleshed out all the truths of the gospel in one generation or several generations. Or would you like to speak to that distinctly Christian character of things like the Renaissance and appreciating creation and so on?
Well, it's amazing that, go back to the allegorical interpretation only of the Song of Songs, right? Let him kiss me with the kisses of his mouth. Well, it doesn't really mean kiss. It's not really talking about kissing, because that you can't know. When let him wander among my lilies. Okay, what's that mean? He's not talking about, what it means our relationship to God. Yeah, that's not the first thing people would think when they read that book, right? Come on. But I think, well, this is our problem, right? We think the only place people can get things wrong is when it comes to sex. You know, that people can use can their erotic attractions can be disordered, and that can lead them to this or that problem. It's the same thing with theological propositions. You know, with anything, you can be disordered. Why does it just have to be that? You know, and that's what I think the problem is if you try to ignore it or hide away or paint a loincloth over it, you're just letting it fester and become a pathology. You know, it's you're setting up the conditions for it to be sickened because you're acting like it's sick, right? William Blake, one of my favorite quotes from William Blake is, "And they became what they beheld." Right, and he's talking about people so if they're obsessing about sexuality in the church or this or right, you focus on the bad, you're going to become what you behold. Mm-hmm. I think it's a very true psychological principle. So how do you redeem that? Right? Do you hide it? Is that the way to do it? You hide it because, which to me, that's a gesture of shame. So is that the way to address shame? Is to be ashamed of shame? Or do you somehow have to bring it to the light, or bring it, or baptize it in somehow? Which is what I think Michelangelo was doing in the Renaissance artists. I think they were baptizing the body, rebaptizing the body, and presenting it in a way that was not shameful. Right? I think that was one of the hopeful points about the Renaissance is it was reimagining the world in a truly Christian way, for all the problems that there were. I mean, it was not a perfect society or anything, but in the arts in particular, they were you could say making it sacralizing the body.
Yeah, beautiful.
And Blake was doing that too. Blake was doing that later. So, and I think other people through history have tried to do that. I think Dante does it, right? Certainly, Dante's doing it.
Marvelous. And maybe we should say that even though you think that the Reformation was more, when you talk about nominalism, like earlier nominalism, and then the Reformation was a big problem. It's not like we're just being one-sided against Protestantism or Protestants, but that there is it fair to say that even there's a lot of things that Protestants have emphasized, at least in parts, that we can appreciate? And like for me, I find even like pastors like Tim Keller in America, some of his books and stuff about prayer and the word of God have helped me refocus on the importance of the word. For example, it's not to say that toss out everything, but that there was a larger change with the Reformation than the Renaissance, that came more from outside the church, or wasn't an organic outgrowth of the church in the way the Renaissance was. What's the distinction that we might make between those two?
I mean, well, there were good things that came with. I mean, I think. Well, I don't know. I mean, the liberal. I mean, just what would. Well, there was a liberal. There were corruptions in the church that needed to be addressed. And they weren't. And then the Counter Reformation made things worse. I think, going the other direction. The Council of Trent. Oh, you think we're too strict, huh? Well, we're going to get stricter, right? Right?
Yeah.
And I think if you look before that time, that was a different. I mean, before the Reformation, it seems like Christendom in the West was messy, but it wasn't centralized. Wasn't centralized. That's why I appreciate Robert Herrick so much, because he seems to recapture some of what I think must have been the ethos of medieval or pre-Reformation Christendom, at least in the countryside. I think it was a more multifarious there was multifarious and cohesive than we give it credit for. And on the other hand, was interesting to me in Protestant history is, my first book, Literary Encounter with God in Post-Reformation England. It's mostly about Protestant figures. And I think there was right then, that kind of like the heyday of Protestant mysticism, which is where Sophiology, in a way, the modern birth of Sophiology started there with Jakob Burma, the Philadelphian Society, Robert Flood. We talked about other people, even, so there was a lot of beautiful things that came out of the Protestant Reformation, and I think part of it had to do, interestingly, with the Eucharist. Now, John Donne has a book called Essays in Divinity, which he's trying to puzzle out all these theological problems, because he came from a Catholic family. His great uncle was Thomas More, I think, and so his uncle and his two immediate, the brothers of his mom were both Jesuits in the Jesuit mission in England, but he becomes an Anglican priest. But he's trying to puzzle out all these religious problems, and I think he was traumatized. I think he, as a little boy, witnessed the execution and martyrdom of Edmund Campion, and I don't know if he witnessed it, but I know he knew Robert Southwell, the other Jesuit, because I'm pretty sure Robert Southwell was his catechism teacher on the Underground. So he was about 23 or 24 when Southwell was martyred. So I think he was suffering from PTSD. So he was trying to figure out what this religious problem is. And in his book, Essays in Divinity, he's talking about the different debates about the Eucharist, with transubstantiation in the Catholic opinion, which was a late innovation. It didn't come until the late Middle Ages. And then the consubstantiation of the Lutherans, and the refusal to commit to either one from the Anglicans, right? Like the Via Media. And I think he's pointing to, and I think that was actually a good thing to think about, and actually that it's kind of a rejection of scholasticism, but at least it's well, if not a rejection, at least a questioning of it. Do we have to have a definition for everything? Can't we just say, as in the Orthodox, right? Can we just say it's a mystery? Do we have to tell me how it works? Because if you tell me how it works, it really doesn't sound as impressive as if I just let it be a mystery. So I think that kind of freedom of thought was good from the Reformation. But on the other hand, as Martin Luther said, "Oh great, now I've turned every barmaid in Germany into a scripture scholar." So there's that part too, right? Let's let everybody read the Bible. That was great. Only one problem: we let everybody read the Bible. And I'm look at how many Protestant sects just popped up in the first 100 years of the Reformation. So, it's complicated.
Yeah, I think to what maybe helps me frame it a wee bit. Maybe, I don't know if this is too optimistic, but Father Alexander Main, the way he talks about history, he says about now talk about the early fathers as if they're the early church, but in the grand scheme of history, maybe we are the early church, who knows? And we've had these teething problems, and maybe we'll come to greater unity and so on.
I think so.
I
think that was actually
crosses borders.
Trying to find out what the primitive church was. And there are good things and bad things with all of this, right? So it's, I'm not a big fan of the austere worship of some Protestant denominations. But on the other hand, I think, one of my comrades in arms is John Milbank, and he's an Anglican. His wife's an Anglican priest. And he's got the right approach to it. And so does she. I mean, she's got, if you ever get a chance to, she teaches at Nottingham University. Alison Milbank, and she's got wonderful videos. She's got one on Lammas bread, and talking about the Feast of Lammas in August. And the thing is, the Anglican Church, much of it is the pre-Reformation Catholic Church, the Rite of Sarum, and I think when I was a kid and I went to an Anglican church, I had no idea it was in a church that wasn't Catholic. It seemed pretty Catholic to me, So there's a lot out there now, I think, especially within the radical orthodoxy movement, which gives me hope.
Yeah, God. Thank God for them. And just before we go then this evening, is there anything that you'd like to tell us about your forthcoming book, which sounds most exciting, Sophia in Exile, and what we might expect?
Well, I'm hoping to finish it. Well, I'm kind of on breakneck speed. I usually write pretty quickly, but this one I wrote one chapter a year ago, and another chapter like a half year before that. And at first, usually I work pretty quickly, but I got busy. Well, what happened is the COVID thing happened, and I thought I was going to have all this time to work on that, but it was kind of chaotic, and my head was spinning. So, and then I got really busy with the farm last April. And then the farm work came to a stop, or the big part of the growing season came to a stop in October. And then I started thinking about going back to writing. So I started writing in November again. And since then I have 3 chapters done, or 4. So right now I have a chapter on marriage, or marriage and sexuality. I have a chapter on Nikolai Berdyaev's eschatology. I have a chapter on the creation, on our relationship to creation. And then I have a chapter on the creation in another sense, which means creativity, the creative act. And then I think I'm almost done with the chapter I decided to write on fairies and I put in what do they call it, the invisible country. Because it's interesting to me. In fact, I had a conversation not too long ago, which I think maybe decide I should do this. I was giving a talk at Hillsdale College, which is close by. And afterwards, I met with the faculty, and we're talking about all kinds of things. And the subject of fairies came up, and whether fairies existed. And I told them a story about my daughter, who is 24. And when she was little, she saw these little people in our garden. Well, while my wife was raking leaves, and I said, she said, "Stop, Mom, those people." And my wife didn't see them. And I forgot about it, and I mentioned it on Thanksgiving a couple of years ago when all the kids were home. And she said, "Oh yeah, they were there. I don't know what it was, but they were there." So I was talking about it with these professors, and quite a few of them said, "Yeah, I think there exists too." And we're talking about, every culture on earth has said that this stuff exists, but no one's ever figured out what it is. So I decided I would write a chapter on that, because I still don't know exactly what to make of it, but it's been a fun chapter to write, because especially in the light of all the darkness out there in the world right now, to write about something where you enter the mind of a child has been a blessing. And then I have a couple more chapters. I think I have a chapter I'm going to do on, I think, Thomas Traherne and Eleanor Fargen. Do you know her?
Yeah. Hello,
yeah, Eleanor Fargen. And I don't know if I'm going to do one on each of them, or one chapter on both of them, but that'll probably be what I do next. And I've been waiting to write something substantial on Thomas Traherne for a while. I wrote an introduction for his Centuries of Meditations for Angelico Press about a year ago, which that's only about 10 pages long though. So I'm hoping to get into that, and so hopefully let's have a couple more chapters to get done. So I'm looking forward to it.
Amazing. We look forward to it, and thank you very much again, Michael.
Hey, thank you.
God bless you.
God bless you.